The midday Athenian sun was unforgiving, baking the ancient limestone until it practically hummed with heat. Hadrian had left the excavation site early, carrying 2 iced coffees, intending to surprise his wife, Lumina, at the museum archives. Instead, he found her in the shadowed, bougainvillea-draped alley of Plaka, pressed against the stone wall, her hands tangled in the hair of a man who was decidedly not her husband. The iced coffees slipped from Hadrian's numb fingers, the plastic shattering against the cobblestones, a sharp crack that was swallowed by the city's noise. It wasn't just the visceral shock of her lips on another man's. It was the chilling realization that at this exact moment, the security cameras at the new excavation site had been mysteriously disabled. There was a secret breathing beneath the surface of his marriage, far older and darker than the ruins they unearthed. If stories of deeply buried secrets, beautiful betrayals, and the heavy price of revenge speak to you, stay with me. The Athenian heat was not just a temperature, it was a physical weight. It pressed down on the marble columns, distorted the horizon with shimmering waves, and made the air taste of dust and exhaust. Hadrian wiped the sweat from his brow, his fingers stained with the pale, chalky soil of the new excavation site just south of the Acropolis. It had been a grueling 3 weeks. They had finally breached the inner chamber of the Hellenistic foundation they'd been mapping for years. He was exhausted, his muscles aching with a deep, satisfying fatigue. But more than that, he missed his wife. Lumina had been distant lately, citing the overwhelming paperwork at the museum archives. He missed the way her eyes lit up when they dusted off a piece of history, the shared language of the past that had bound them together for 7 years. Deciding to end his shift early, Hadrian brushed the dirt from his linen trousers and bought 2 iced Freddo espressos from a corner cafe. He imagined her smile, the way she would push her dark hair behind her ear when he walked into the cool, air-conditioned silence of the archives. He took the shortcut through Plaka, a labyrinth of narrow, winding streets draped in vibrant bougainvillea. The tourist crowds were thin in the oppressive afternoon sun. As he turned the corner near a shuttered taverna, a flash of emerald green caught his eye. It was Lumina's dress, the silk one he had bought her for their anniversary in Florence. Hadrian stopped, a smile touching his lips, about to call out her name. The word died in his throat. She was not walking toward the museum. She was pressed back against the rough, sun-baked stone wall of a blind alley. And she was not alone. A man, tall, dressed in a sharp, dark suit that seemed entirely out of place in the ancient, dusty alley, had his hands buried in her hair. His face was buried in her neck. Lumina's eyes were closed, her head tilted back, her hands gripping the lapels of his jacket with a desperate, crushing intensity. Hadrian couldn't breathe. The air in his lungs turned to glass. He stood paralyzed behind the corner of a crumbling wall, watching his wife, his brilliant, beautiful Lumina, whimper softly as the stranger's mouth moved over hers. It wasn't a fleeting, accidental kiss. It was deep, hungry, and devastatingly familiar. It was the kiss of people who had done this 100 times before. The plastic cups in Hadrian's hands suddenly felt impossibly heavy. His fingers went numb. The cups slipped, hitting the cobblestones with a sharp crack. Ice and dark coffee splattered across the ancient stones, pooling like dark blood in the crevices. Lumina gasped, pushing the man away, her eyes snapping open. She looked around, panicked, like a deer caught in a spotlight. Hadrian pressed his back flat against the wall, out of sight, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He closed his eyes, while rising in his throat. The image of her hands on the stranger's chest burned into his retinas. Who is he? The thought screamed in his mind. How long? He waited, holding his breath until he heard the rapid click of her heels fading in the opposite direction, followed by the heavy, measured footsteps of the man. When the alley was silent again, save for the hum of cicadas, Hadrian stepped out. He stared at the puddle of melting ice and spilled coffee. His hands were trembling so violently he had to clench them into fists. Before the grief could fully shatter him, his phone vibrated in his pocket. The screen flashed with an urgent call from the site foreman. Hadrian answered, his voice sounding hollow, like it belonged to a ghost. Yes, Costas. Hadrian. The foreman's voice was frantic, breathless. You need to get back here. The security cameras went dark for 10 minutes. The chamber. Costas swallowed hard. The golden laurel wreath. It's gone. Hadrian stood in the alleyway, the smell of his wife's perfume still hanging faintly in the hot air. The artifact they had spent 3 years searching for was missing. And in that same exact hour, his wife was in the arms of another man. A cold, terrifying clarity washed over the burning betrayal in his chest. This wasn't a coincidence. Nothing in Athens ever was. The apartment overlooking Lycabettus Hill had always been their sanctuary. Filled with leather-bound volumes on classical antiquity, framed sketches of their early digs in Crete, and the warm, golden light of the Athenian evening, it was a monument to their shared history. When Hadrian turned his key in the lock, the heavy wooden door opened with a familiar groan. For the first time in 7 years, he felt like a trespasser in his own home. Lumina was in the kitchen. The scent of roasted garlic and lemon filled the air, mingling with the faint, lingering notes of her jasmine perfume. The same perfume that had clung to the stifling air of the Plaka alleyway just hours before. You're late, she called out, her voice a melodic hum over the sound of sizzling olive oil. She stepped into the archway, wiping her hands on a linen apron over the emerald green dress. Her dark hair was neatly pinned back now, every strand perfectly in place, erasing the desperate, tangled mess Hadrian had witnessed earlier. Costas called the museum. He said there was some sort of security glitch at the site. Hadrian stood in the foyer, his briefcase feeling like a block of lead in his grip. He looked at her face, the elegant slope of her nose, the dark, intelligent eyes that had captivated him in graduate school. She was a flawless portrait of a concerned wife and a dedicated colleague. Yes, Hadrian forced the word out. His throat felt lined with sandpaper. He set his briefcase down, focusing entirely on the mechanics of taking off his shoes to avoid meeting her gaze. A blackout. 10 minutes. The new chamber was compromised. Compromised? Lumina's brow furrowed in perfect, symmetrical worry. She walked over, placing a gentle hand on his arm. Her touch, once his greatest comfort, sent a jolt of pure ice through his veins. It took every ounce of his willpower not to flinch. Did we lose anything? The wreath? We are still taking inventory, he lied, the words tasting like ash. He looked up, finally meeting her eyes. They were wide, clear, and utterly deceptive. Where were you this afternoon? I tried to call the archives around too. Lumina turned back toward the kitchen, her movements smooth and unhurried. Oh, you know how spotty the reception is in the basement vaults. I was elbow deep in the Byzantine manifests. It was suffocating down there. I barely took a lunch break. She plated the sea base, setting the dining table with practiced elegance. Hadrian sat opposite her, the silence of the apartment suddenly deafening. The clinking of silver forks against porcelain sounded like the striking of a judge's gavel. He watched her eat, dissecting her every micro-expression. How many times had they sat at this exact table, sharing wine and debating the historical significance of their finds, while she harbored a secret life? He thought of the stranger's hands on her waist, the hunger in her posture. He thought of the empty pedestal in the subterranean chamber where the golden laurel wreath had rested for 2 millennia. The timeline was too tight. The cameras at the excavation site had gone blind at exactly 2:15 p.m. At 2:20 p.m., Lumina had been pressed against a stone wall, moaning softly into the mouth of a man in a tailored suit. A man who did not look like an academic. You're quiet tonight, Lumina observed, taking a delicate sip of her Assertico wine. You look pale, Hadrian. It's just a security glitch. Costas will figure it out. We will secure the chamber tomorrow. I'm just tired, Hadrian murmured, picking up his glass. The wine was cold, but it did nothing to quench the fire burning in his chest. He looked at the woman across from him, realizing with a terrifying, absolute certainty that the Lumina he loved had died long ago, replaced by a beautiful, calculating stranger. And as he stared at her perfectly painted lips, Hadrian made a silent, devastating vow. He would not scream. He would not shatter the plates or demand a confession. He would dig. He would unearth every dirty, buried secret she held, even if the excavation destroyed them both. The National Archaeological Museum of Athens was a fortress of neoclassical grandeur, a sanctuary built to preserve the dead. Stepping through its heavy bronze doors the morning after the silent dinner, Hadrian felt entirely like a ghost haunting its marble corridors. He had left the apartment before Lumina woke, unable to bear the sight of her sleeping face, untroubled and breathtakingly deceitful against the white linen pillows. Officially, Hadrian was there to cross-reference excavation logs, preparing a cover story for the authorities regarding the delayed reporting of the stolen Hellenistic wreath. Unofficially, he was a man hunting for the remnants of his own sanity. He needed to know if the archives, her supposed alibi, held any truth. The descent into the basement levels felt like stepping into a tomb. The air grew cooler, thick with the scent of old paper, binding glue, and the faint, sterile bite of preservation chemicals. He navigated the labyrinth of towering metal shelves until he reached the Byzantine section, half expecting to find Lumina's discarded coffee cup or a stray pen. Instead, he found Linnea. Linnea was a fixture at the museum, a sharp-eyed guide and archivist who seemed to know the cataloged history of every pebble in the building. She was currently hunched over a card of leather-bound manifests, her blonde hair tied in a messy knot, a magnifying glass resting on her collarbone. "Dr. Hadrian," Linnea said, looking up, her sharp blue eyes instantly catching the dark circles under his. "You look like you've been digging with your bare hands all night. I heard whispers about a technical glitch at the news site. Everything intact?" "A minor setback," Hadrian lied smoothly, though his heart hammered against his ribs. He approached the cart, casually tracing the spine of a ledger. "I was actually looking for Lumina. She mentioned she was elbow-deep in these exact Byzantine manifests yesterday afternoon. I hoped she left her notes behind." Linnea paused. The easy, academic atmosphere between them suddenly fractured. She looked down at the manifest in her hands, then back up at Hadrian, her expression tightening into a mask of careful hesitation. In the harsh fluorescent light of the basement, the silence stretched, heavy and dangerous. "Dr. Lumina wasn't in the Byzantine section yesterday afternoon, Hadrian," Linnea said, her voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial murmur. Hadrian's fingers gripped the metal shelf. The cold steel bit into his skin, grounding him. "Are you sure?" She was quite adamant about the workload. "I was down here from noon until closing." "The section was empty," Linnea replied, holding his gaze. She stepped closer, lowering her voice even further, the air between them thick with unspoken implications. "But she did come in early yesterday morning, before the museum opened to the public." "For what?" Hadrian asked, his voice barely a rasp. Linnea glanced over her shoulder at the empty aisle before answering. "She requested the physical master keys from my desk, the ones for sub-basement C, the old storage vaults." A chilling wave of adrenaline crashed through Hadrian's veins. Sub-basement C had been decommissioned a decade ago. It held no antiquities, only the architectural blueprints of the museum and the original, foundational wiring grids that connected the city's older archaeological sites, including the security network for their current excavation. Did she say why? Hadrian forced his facial muscles to remain impassive, projecting a mild, husbandly curiosity that he did not feel. "She said it was for a routine structural review," Linnea noted, her eyes narrowing slightly, clearly reading the tension radiating from his posture. "But she kept the keys for 3 hours. And Hadrian, she looked nervous. I've never seen Lumina nervous." The pieces clicked together in Hadrian's mind with the brutal, heavy finality of a closing vault door. The disabled cameras at 2:15 p.m. The lover in the alleyway at 2:20 p.m. The lie about the archives. It wasn't just an affair of passion. Lumina hadn't just given another man her body. She had handed him the keys to Hadrian's life's work. The lover in the tailored suit wasn't just a romantic rival. He was a thief, and Lumina was his inside man. "Thank you, Linnea," Hadrian managed to say, turning away before she could see the absolute devastation breaking across his face. "I'll make sure to ask her about it." As he walked away, the shadows of the archive seemed to swallow him whole. The investigation had irrevocably shifted. He was no longer just a betrayed husband. He was a man standing at the edge of an abyss, preparing to pull his wife down with him. Hadrian had spent his entire adult life tracking the movements of dead civilizations. He knew how to read the subtle depressions in the earth, the scattered fragments of pottery that indicated a forgotten trade route, the ash layers that told of ancient, catastrophic fires. He never imagined he would have to apply those same meticulous, analytical skills to his own wife. It was Thursday afternoon. Lumina had kissed his cheek that morning, a gesture so practiced and light it made his stomach turn, and announced she had an off-site meeting with a private benefactor in Kolonaki. Hadrian had waited exactly 10 minutes before following her cab. The upscale Kolonaki district was a stark contrast to the dusty, sun-baked trenches of the Acropolis excavation site. Here, the air smelled of expensive espresso and imported leather, the sidewalks shaded by manicured trees. Hadrian parked his beaten Land Rover down the street from the Hotel Pindar, a boutique establishment known for its absolute discretion and exorbitant rates. He sat behind the steering wheel, the engine off, the stifling heat of the car acting as a suffocating cocoon. He watched through the viewfinder of his long-lens camera, the same camera he used to document delicate stratigraphy layers in the dirt. His hands, usually steady enough to brush centuries of dust from a fragile clay vessel, trembled violently. At exactly 2 p.m., a sleek, Blacktown car pulled up to the hotel's entrance. The man from the Plaka alleyway stepped out. He was dressed flawlessly again in a charcoal suit, moving with the predatory confidence of a man who owned everything he surveyed. 10 minutes later, Lumina arrived on foot. She wore a dark trench coat despite the warmth of the afternoon, her head bowed, oversized designer sunglasses shielding her face from the world. Through the magnified lens, Hadrian watched the greeting. There was no desperate kiss this time, only a brief, familiar touch of the man's hand against the small of Lumina's back as he guided her through the revolving glass doors. It was a gesture of quiet possession, intimate and casual, that struck Hadrian harder than a physical blow. The dilemma tore at him with vicious teeth. He could cross the street right now. He could march into that marble-floored lobby, flash his credentials, demand the room number, and kick the door off its hinges. The urge to confront them, to scream until his vocal cords tore, to drag Lumina out by the wrist, and demand the location of the Hellenistic wreath, was a physical pressure building behind his eyes. But if he did, the trap would spring empty. He would have his explosive, humiliating climax, but the artifact, the crowning achievement of his career and the heritage of his country, would vanish into the black market forever. Lumina would play the victim, claiming it was just a romantic affair, denying any knowledge of the security breach or the theft. He had to swallow the poison. He had to let it burn through his veins. Hadrian lowered the camera, resting his forehead against the searing hot steering wheel. He closed his eyes, but the darkness offered no relief. Instead, his mind cruelly projected the images he was trying so desperately to avoid. He pictured the heavy hotel room door clicking shut. He imagined the trench coat falling to the floor, the stranger's hands mapping the terrain of his wife's body, a body Hadrian had mapped, cherished, and worshipped for 7 uninterrupted years. The psychological torture was a living, breathing entity in the car with him, wrapping its cold fingers around his throat. He lifted the camera one last time, aiming at the 4th-floor windows where the heavy velvet curtains had just been drawn shut. He took a series of photographs, documenting the date, the time, the location. He was building a new archive now, not of ancient kings and lost cities, but of his own ruined marriage. Every lie was an artifact, every secret meeting a bone fragment. And Hadrian would not stop digging until he had unearthed the entire, devastating skeleton. Hadrian drove back to the apartment with a mechanical, empty precision. The image of the drawn velvet curtains at the Hotel Pindar was a brand seared into his prefrontal cortex. He knew he had perhaps an hour, maybe 2, depending on the stamina of her betrayal. before Lumina would return to play the exhausted, dedicated archaeologist. He needed to use this window. He needed physical proof that connected her afternoon in Kalinaki to the empty pedestal beneath the Acropolis. Lumina's study was a sanctuary within their sanctuary. It was a small room lined with floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves, smelling of dried lavender and aged parchment. Usually, Hadrian respected the invisible boundary at the threshold. Today, he crossed it like an invading army. His hands moved with a frantic but methodical grace. He started with the obvious, the drawers of her antique writing desk. He sifted through utility bills, unsent greeting cards, and meticulous notes on Byzantine pottery shards. Nothing. He checked the pockets of her winter coats hanging in the small closet. Nothing. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked, each heavy swing of the pendulum a reminder of the time slipping away. Panic, cold and sharp, began to gnaw at his edges. What if he was wrong? What if the affair was just an affair and the theft was a catastrophic, unrelated coincidence? The dilemma twisted like a knife. If he found nothing, he was merely a paranoid, cuckolded husband tearing apart his wife's privacy. If he found something, his life as he knew it was officially, irreversibly dead. He turned his attention to the bookshelves. Lumina had an organizational system only she understood, sorting texts by excavation site rather than author. Hadrian's eyes scanned the spines. His gaze caught on a thick, leather-bound volume on the lower shelf, the topography of ancient Athens. It was a common text, one they both had multiple copies of, but this specific edition was wedged between two larger books on Roman aqueducts. It was out of place. Hadrian pulled the book free. It felt unnaturally light in his hands. His breath hitched as he opened the cover. The pages had been glued together and expertly carved out from the center, forming a neat, rectangular cavity. Resting inside the hollowed space was a single, heavy iron key. It was covered in a thick layer of rust, the teeth worn down by decades, perhaps centuries, of use. It was entirely archaic, vastly different from the sleek magnetic keycards used for the museum's modern security or the brass keys for their apartment. Hadrian lifted it. The cold metal bit into his palm. It smelled faintly of damp earth and oxidized iron. This was not a key to a hotel room. This was not a key to a lover's modern flat. Hadrian's mind raced back to Linnea's whisper in the museum basement. She requested the physical master keys, the ones for sub-basement C, the old storage vaults. But Linnea had also said Lumina returned those keys. This rusted iron was something else entirely. It belonged to an older, forgotten architecture. Athens was a city built on top of itself, riddled with subterranean catacombs, forgotten Ottoman cellars, and abandoned transit tunnels that connected to the very foundations of the Acropolis. Hadrian closed his fist around the rusted key, the jagged edges pressing painfully into his skin. The physical pain was a welcome distraction from the agonizing realization blooming in his chest. His wife was not merely sleeping with a stranger. She was preparing to unlock a door that should never be opened, moving in shadows deeper than he had ever dared to dig. He slipped the key into his pocket, carefully replaced the hollow book on the shelf, and smoothed down his wrinkled shirt. He stepped out of the study and walked into the living room, picking up a trade journal just as the heavy brass mechanism of the front door began to turn. The rain started at dusk, a sudden, violent summer storm that washed the Athenian dust into slick, treacherous mud. Hadrian stood under the dripping awning of a defunct kiosk near Monastiraki Square, the collar of his trench coat turned up against the chill. The rusted key felt like a lump of hot coal in his pocket, a physical anchor to the surreal nightmare his life had become. He had called the only man he knew who trafficked in shadows. Nikos, a former student turned investigative journalist who occasionally rubbed shoulders with the less savory elements of the city's antiquities trade. Nikos arrived 15 minutes late, shaking water from an oversized umbrella. He was a thin, nervous man with perpetual ink stains on his fingers, smelling faintly of cheap tobacco and stale coffee. "Dr. Hadrian," Nikos murmured, his eyes darting toward the sparse crowd seeking shelter in the square. "You sounded urgent. And paranoid." Not a good combination for a man in your position, especially with the rumors flying out of the Acropolis site. Hadrian didn't waste time on pleasantries. He reached into his coat and slid a manila envelope across the damp metal ledge of the kiosk. Inside were the printed photographs he had taken from his car outside the Hotel Pinder, the charcoal-suited man, the possessive hand on Lumina's back, the expensive town car. "I need a name," Hadrian said, his voice as flat and unyielding as the cobblestones beneath their feet. "And I need to know what he does. Fast." Nikos opened the envelope, shielding the glossy prints from the rain. He stared at the images for a long time, the glow of a nearby street lamp illuminating a sudden, sharp tightening in his jaw. When he finally looked up, the nervous energy was gone, replaced by a grim, sobering caution. "Hadrian, where did you get these?" Nikos asked, tapping the photograph of the man's face. "Does it matter?" "It matters if you want to keep breathing without a tube," Nikos replied softly. He slid the photos back into the envelope and handed them over as if they were toxic. "His name is Elias Vane. Officially, he's a venture capitalist operating out of Geneva. Unofficially, he is one of the most prolific, untouchable fences for high-end, black-market antiquities in the Mediterranean." The air left Hadrian's lungs in a slow, agonizing rush. "Vane doesn't deal in broken pottery or loose coins, Hadrian," Nikos continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, glancing around nervously. "He deals in the impossible. Things that belong in national museums but end up in private, subterranean vaults in Dubai or London. He is a ghost. If you are tracking him," Nikos trailed off, his eyes tracing the hollow exhaustion in Hadrian's face. "The missing Hellenistic wreath. Jesus Christ, Hadrian. Tell me this isn't connected." Hadrian stared out into the driving rain, the neon lights of the square bleeding into smeared, chaotic colors. The pieces didn't just click together. They slammed into place with the force of a collapsing tomb. Elias Vane, the man his wife was sleeping with. The man who orchestrated the theft of the wreath. The man who had likely funded the entire operation through Lumina's access and expertise. "I can't tell you that, Nikos," Hadrian whispered, a profound, sickening clarity washing over him. The dilemma was no longer about whether to confront his wife. It was about how far into the dark he had to walk to stop them both. He had to cross the line from a betrayed husband to a vigilante architect, building a trap as intricate as the ruins they had excavated. "Stay away from Vane," Nikos warned, backing away into the rain. "He's not a man who negotiates, Hadrian. He erases." Hadrian watched Nikos disappear into the storm. He reached into his pocket, his fingers tracing the cold, jagged teeth of the rusted key. The betrayal was no longer just a wound. It was a weapon, and Hadrian was finally ready to use it. The grand atrium of the National Archaeological Museum was ablaze with the cold, unforgiving light of crystal chandeliers. It was the annual fundraising gala, a night usually dedicated to celebrating the preservation of history. Tonight, for Hadrian, it was a theater of the absurd, a suffocating masquerade where every smile felt like a razor blade. He stood near the towering bronze statue of Poseidon, a glass of champagne growing warm in his rigid grip. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low, murmuring hum of wealthy donors and esteemed academics. Lumina was across the room, radiant in a backless, midnight blue gown that clung to her like a second skin. She was laughing, the sound crystalline and sharp, as she charmed a group of Swiss investors. She played the role of the brilliant, dedicated co-director perfectly. It was a flawless performance, save for the fact that Hadrian now knew she was a hollow, beautiful shell filled with lies. He watched her with a morbid, obsessive intensity. He tracked the micro-expressions he had once adored, the way her eyes crinkled when she smiled, the elegant tilt of her neck, and saw only the calculated mechanics of a grifter. The urge to cross the marble floor, to shatter his glass against the pedestal of a priceless amphora and scream the truth, was a physical pressure building behind his eyes. He wanted to tear the evening gown from her, expose the rot beneath the silk, and demand she confess to the theft of the Hellenistic wreath and the affair with Elias Vane. His knuckles turned white around the delicate stem of the champagne flute. The dilemma tore at him like a wild animal. Do it now, a voice hissed in his mind. Destroy her. Let them all see what she is. He took a step forward, the anger blinding him to the consequences. Dr. Hadrian. A quiet, urgent voice cut through the noise. A hand grasped his forearm, pulling him back into the shadows of the colonnade. It was Linnea. She was dressed simply in a black slip dress, looking drastically out of place among the glittering elite, her sharp blue eyes wide with a frantic intensity. Don't do it, she whispered, her grip surprisingly strong. Hadrian glared at her, the mask of the stoic husband slipping to reveal the raw, unhinged fury beneath. You don't know what I was about to do, Linnea. I know exactly what you were about to do, Hadrian, she replied, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. I've seen men look like that right before they throw their lives away. You are vibrating with it. You want to confront her. She's standing right there. He ground out, the words tasting like ash. Smiling. While the wreath is gone. While she. He choked on the rest of the sentence, unable to speak the name of her lover in this sacred space. Linnea pulled him deeper into the alcove, shielding them from the crowd. Listen to me. If you blow this up now, you get a moment of satisfaction. She will deny it. The museum will cover it up to avoid a scandal, and the wreath disappears forever into Elias Vane's network. Hadrian froze, his eyes snapping to Linnea's face. You know about Vane? I know a lot more than I should, she said grimly. She reached into her small clutch purse and pulled out a folded, encrypted hard drive, pressing it into his palm. It was small, heavy, and cold. What is this? I managed to recover some of Lumina's deleted files from the museum's internal server, Linnea whispered, her eyes darting toward the atrium. She wasn't just looking at the blueprints for Subbasement C. She downloaded the entire subterranean grid connecting the Acropolis site to the old Ottoman sewer lines. And she bypassed the security protocols on a very specific date. 3 weeks ago. The date the site cameras had been installed. She had compromised the system before it was even online. Hadrian stared at the drive in his hand, the physical evidence of his wife's meticulous, cold-blooded treason. The rage that had been boiling overcooled into a terrifying, icy resolve. She has an offshore account, Hadrian. Linnea continued, her voice trembling slightly. A massive transfer is pending. It's scheduled to clear in 3 days. The trap was closing, not just around the artifact, but around Lumina's entire future. She was planning to leave him. She was planning to take the money, the wreath, and disappear with Vane. Hadrian looked across the room. Lumina caught his eye, offering him a brilliant, flawless smile from across the sea of donors. He raised his champagne glass in a silent, mocking toast, his face an impenetrable mask of marble. 3 days, Hadrian whispered, slipping the drive into his tuxedo pocket. The delay was no longer a torture, it was a countdown. He would not destroy her tonight. He would let her think she had won, right up until the moment he buried her alive in her own lies. The apartment was suffocatingly quiet, save for the hum of the air conditioning unit and the harsh, blue glow of Hadrian's laptop illuminating the darkened study. It was 3 a.m. Lumina was asleep in the next room, her breathing steady and peaceful, a stark contrast to the storm raging silently inside Hadrian. He had spent the last 4 hours decrypting the drive Linnea had given him at the gala. It was a tedious, agonizing process, each line of code slowly stripping away the final layers of his marriage. He had prepared himself for love letters, for evidence of hotel bookings or flights to Geneva. He had braced for the painful, humiliating details of an affair. What he found was so much worse. The files were not a diary of a romantic transgression. They were a meticulously organized portfolio of treason. The first folder contained the architectural blueprints Linnea had mentioned, the complete subterranean mapping of the Acropolis excavation site intersecting with the abandoned Ottoman sewer system and Subbasement C. The second folder contained the security protocols. Hadrian stared, his blood running cold, as he recognized his own digital signature on the access logs. Lumina had used his credentials, forged his authorization, to systematically weaken the camera grid 3 weeks prior to the theft. She had orchestrated the blind spot that allowed the Hellenistic wreath to vanish. But it was the third folder, labeled simply EV Correspondences, that finally broke him. It was a cache of encrypted emails between Lumina and Elias Vane. Hadrian's hands shook violently as he clicked open the first message, dated 6 months ago. Elias. The email began, the digital text stark against the white screen. The Hellenistic Foundation is confirmed. We are breaching the inner chamber next month. The laurel wreath is there. It is pristine. The valuation you provided is insufficient. I want 50% of the final sale, wired to the Cayman account, or the access codes remain with my husband. Hadrian read the words again, his vision blurring. Or the access codes remain with my husband. There was no romance in the exchange. There was no desperate, star-crossed love affair. It was purely transactional. The subsequent emails detailed the logistics, the timing of the camera blackout, the extraction route through the old sewers, the use of the rusted key to access the forgotten vault where Vane's men would receive the artifact. And then, the final email, sent just hours before he had found her in the Plaka alleyway. Elias, the extraction is set for tomorrow at 14:15. I will ensure Hadrian is occupied at the archives. The transfer must clear within 72 hours. Once it does, I will leave Athens. Do not contact me on the primary line again. L. The devastating truth hit Hadrian with the force of a physical blow, driving the breath from his lungs. Lumina didn't just fall into an affair. She had initiated it. She had sought out Vane, not for love or passion, but to fence the crowning achievement of Hadrian's career. She had used his life's work as a bargaining chip to fund a massive payout and escape their marriage. The woman he loved, the brilliant archaeologist, the passionate partner, had never existed. She was a ghost he had created in his own mind. The real Lumina was a predator, a calculating thief who had worn his affection like a disguise, using his blind trust to execute a flawless heist. The dilemma that had tortured him for days vanished, replaced by an absolute, terrifying void. He didn't have to choose between saving his marriage or saving the artifact. The marriage was already dead. The only thing left was the artifact and the cold, surgical precision required to take down the monsters who had stolen it. He closed the laptop, the screen going black, plunging the study into darkness. The blue light faded from his face, leaving only a pale, rigid mask. He walked into the bedroom. Lumina was turned away from him, the soft curve of her shoulder exposed in the moonlight filtering through the blinds. He stood at the foot of the bed, watching the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of her chest. He didn't scream. He didn't reach for her throat. The rage was gone, replaced by a profound, chilling emptiness. He was no longer a betrayed husband. He was an executioner, and the trap was finally set. He turned away, walking back into the living room. He picked up his wedding ring from the side table, the gold cool and heavy in his palm. He stared at it for a long moment before setting it down carefully beside a printed copy of the encrypted emails. Some ruins are meant to be unearthed, Hadrian whispered into the silent apartment, his voice devoid of all emotion. Others are better left buried under the dust. The morning sun hit the Acropolis with a harsh, golden brilliance, casting long, mocking shadows over the city. Hadrian sat in a small, anonymous internet cafe near Omonia Square, the air thick with the smell of cheap tobacco and stale coffee. He had barely slept, his mind a terrifyingly clear landscape of cold calculation. He was no longer a husband mourning his marriage. He was an architect designing a tomb. Linnea sat across from him, her eyes bloodshot but sharply focused. She typed rapidly on a heavily encrypted laptop, the screen reflecting a chaotic stream of data. Beside her, Nikos chain-smoked, his nervous energy a stark contrast to Hadrian's eerie stillness. "We need a ghost," Hadrian said, his voice flat, staring at the flashing cursor on Linnea's screen. "Someone with enough capital to make Elias Vane salivate, but obscure enough that his network can't immediately verify the identity. A buyer desperate enough for the Hellenistic wreath to bypass his usual vetting process." "Vane is paranoid, Hadrian. Nikos muttered, crushing a cigarette stub into a tin ashtray. He doesn't deal with unknown entities. If the wire transfer isn't watertight, he'll spook. And if he spooks, the wreath is on a private jet to a vault in Zurich before you can blink. That's why we don't use a new entity, Linnea interjected, her fingers flying across the keyboard. We resurrect an old one. Remember the Alexandrian Syndicate? Nikos frowned. The Russian oligarch group from the late 90s? They went dark after the Interpol raids in 2004. Exactly, Linnea said, a grim smile touching her lips. They went dark, but they were never officially dismantled. Their old encrypted channels still exist in the deep web archives. If we reactivate one of those dormant routing numbers and spoof an initial escrow deposit, Vane will think the syndicate is back in play. Hadrian finished, the pieces of the trap clicking together with deadly precision. He knows their reputation. They pay astronomical premiums for absolute discretion. It's exactly the kind of buyer he needs to fence an item as hot as the wreath. But the money, Nikos argued, leaning forward. You need a legitimate, verifiable proof of funds to lock him in. Vane won't move the artifact to a drop location without seeing the zeros in an escrow account. Hadrian reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a small, worn leather ledger and placed it on the table between them. It was the financial records of the primary benefactor for the Acropolis excavation, a discretionary emergency fund Hadrian had sole control over, intended only for catastrophic site failures. Transfer the entire balance, Hadrian ordered, his voice devoid of hesitation. 2.5 million euros. Route it through the syndicate's ghost accounts. Linnea stopped typing. She looked up at Hadrian, her eyes wide with a mixture of awe and horror. Hadrian, that's professional suicide. If this fails, you won't just lose the wreath. You'll face embezzlement charges. The board will destroy you. The dilemma hung in the stale air of the cafe. It was a terrifying gamble. He was weaponizing his own career, risking prison and permanent disgrace, all to build a snare for his wife and her lover. If Vane saw through the ruse, Hadrian would lose everything he had ever built. But if he did nothing, Lumina would walk away with his life's work and his dignity, leaving him a hollow shell. The board won't know, Hadrian said, his gaze fixed on the laptop screen. Because Vane is going to take the bait. We set the exchange for tomorrow night. The port of Piraeus. Sector 4. It's isolated, deep water access, exactly where a smuggler would want to finalize a maritime extraction. Linnea swallowed hard, her fingers hovering over the keys. And Lumina? She will be there, Hadrian stated, the absolute certainty in his voice chilling the air around them. Vane won't finalize a transaction of this magnitude without his authenticator present. She has to verify the wreath hasn't been swapped before the final transfer. Okay, Linnea breathed, her hands shaking slightly as she initiated the transfer protocols. The Alexandrian Syndicate is officially back online. I'm sending the encrypted ping to Vane's known proxy servers. Hadrian watched the progress bar inch across the screen, a digital countdown to the destruction of his world. The trap was set, baited with his own ruin. All he had to do now was go home, look the woman he had loved for 7 years in the eyes, and wait for the steel jaws to snap shut. The apartment overlooking Lycabettus Hill was bathed in the soft, bruised purple light of twilight. It was their final evening. The air conditioning hummed a low, steady drone, masking the thundering pulse in Hadrian's ears. He sat in his leather armchair, a heavy volume of Thucydides resting unopened on his lap, watching his wife move through the familiar space for what he knew was the last time. Lumina was in a remarkably good mood. The tension that had tightened her features for the past 3 weeks had vanished, replaced by a luminous, almost euphoric lightness. She was humming a faint, wordless melody as she poured 2 glasses of Assyrtiko, the crystal catching the fading sunlight. Costas called again, she said, her voice smooth and untroubled, walking over to hand him a glass. The police have officially classified the wreath's disappearance as a highly organized, professional heist. They think the thieves are already out of the country. Hadrian took the glass, his fingers brushing hers. Her skin was warm, vibrant with the anticipation of her impending escape. He looked up at her face, the beautiful, flawless mask of the woman who had sold his life's work for an offshore account. Out of the country, Hadrian repeated, his voice dangerously hollow. He took a sip of the wine, the cold, crisp taste doing nothing to soothe the ash in his mouth. I suppose that makes sense. It would require a sophisticated network. Someone like Elias Vane. The name dropped into the quiet apartment like a stone into a still pond. For a fraction of a second, the light in Lumina's eyes faltered. A microscopic tightening at the corners of her mouth, a sudden stillness in her breath. Then, the mask snapped back into place, seamless and perfect. Elias Vane? She repeated, a puzzled frown creasing her brow. She took a sip of her own wine, her hand perfectly steady. I'm not familiar with the name. Is he a local dealer? Hadrian watched her, a profound, agonizing admiration mixing with his revulsion. She was magnificent in her deception. He wanted to shatter the wine glass against the wall, to drag her by the wrist to the encrypted laptop hidden in his study, and force her to read her own treasonous emails aloud. The dilemma roared in his chest, a final, desperate urge to confront her, to demand why 7 years of marriage meant less to her than a wire transfer. But if he broke now, the sting at Piraeus would collapse. Vane would vanish with the wreath, and Lumina would disappear into the wind, leaving Hadrian with nothing but ruins. No, Hadrian lied smoothly, leaning back in his chair. An old rumor. A ghost story Nikos mentioned. Probably nothing. Lumina smiled, a soft, indulgent expression that made Hadrian's stomach turn. She set her glass down on the side table and moved closer, sitting on the arm of his chair. She reached out, her cool fingers gently tracing the line of his jaw. You've been so stressed, Hadrian, she murmured, her voice dripping with a manufactured tenderness that felt like a physical violation. You need to sleep. Tomorrow is a new day. We will rebuild the exhibition. We always do. She leaned down, her dark hair falling forward to curtain them both in the scent of jasmine. Her lips met his. It was a slow, deep kiss, terrifyingly familiar and utterly empty. Hadrian closed his eyes. The physical memory of 1,000 other kisses, in the dust of the Acropolis, in the rain in Florence, on their wedding day, crashed over him like a suffocating wave. He tasted the wine on her tongue, felt the soft pressure of her mouth, and knew with absolute certainty that this was a goodbye she didn't realize she was giving. He didn't pull away. He kissed her back. He poured all of his grief, his rage, and his broken, lingering love into that single, devastating contact. It was the kiss of a man mourning a corpse. He mapped the contours of her face one last time, committing the sensation to memory, knowing that tomorrow she would be a prisoner and he would be a ghost. Lumina pulled back slightly, her breath catching, perhaps surprised by the intensity of his response. She smiled, her eyes soft and deceptive. I love you, Hadrian, she whispered. Hadrian looked at her, his face a mask of carved marble, his heart a blackened, dead thing in his chest. I know, he said softly, the lie slipping effortlessly from his lips. He watched her stand and walk toward the bedroom, her silhouette framed by the darkening doorway. The trap was locked. The bait was taken. All that remained was the final, brutal unearthing. The port of Piraeus at 2 a.m. was a labyrinth of rust and salt. Sector 4 was an abandoned graveyard of shipping containers, the air thick with the smell of diesel and decaying fish. The only light came from the sickly, orange glow of a few distant sodium lamps, casting long, skeletal shadows across the wet tarmac. Hadrian sat in the back of a black, unmarked van, the air conditioning struggling against the oppressive humidity. Beside him, Nikos was pale and sweating profusely, clutching a silenced pistol with white-knuckled intensity. In the front seat, Linnea monitored a bank of glowing screens, tracking the encrypted ping of the €2.5 million wire transfer. They're here, Linnea whispered, her voice tight with adrenaline. Through the tinted window, Hadrian watched a sleek, dark Mercedes SUV roll silently into the clearing between two towering stacks of rusted containers. The headlights cut through the fog, illuminating a small, steel-reinforced crate resting on the wet pavement. The driver's side door opened. Elias Vane stepped out. Even in the grim surroundings of the docks, Vane moved with the predatory elegance of a man who owned the night. He wore a dark, tailored overcoat, his face an impenetrable mask of cold authority. He scanned the perimeter, a suppressed automatic weapon resting casually against his thigh. A moment later, the passenger door opened. Lumina stepped down onto the wet tarmac. Hadrian stopped breathing. The physical impact of seeing her there, dressed in dark clothes, her hair pulled back sharply, standing shoulder to shoulder with the man who was fencing his life's work, was more devastating than any photograph. She looked calm, professional, and utterly lethal. She was the architect of his ruin, and she was beautiful. "The transfer is locked," Linnea reported, her fingers flying over the keyboard. "The escrow is holding. Vane's proxy is verifying the funds." Vane pulled a heavy, encrypted tablet from his coat pocket. He tapped the screen, his eyes narrowing in the harsh light. He nodded once, a sharp, decisive movement, and gestured toward the steel crate. Lumina walked toward it, her heels clicking softly against the pavement. She knelt, her movements precise and practiced. She pulled a small crowbar from her coat and wedged it under the reinforced lid, applying pressure until the metal groaned and popped open. Inside the crate, resting on a bed of custom-molded foam, was the Hellenistic wreath. Even under the sickly orange light of the port, the ancient gold gleamed with an impossible, breathtaking luster. It was perfectly intact, the delicate, overlapping leaves a testament to a civilization long dead. "It's pristine," Lumina said, her voice carrying clearly across the quiet docks. She reached out, her fingers tracing the curve of the gold. "The authenticity is confirmed, Elias. It's exactly as I documented it." Hadrian's hands curled into fists, his fingernails biting into his palms. She was appraising the very thing she had sworn to protect, selling the history of their country to a ghost. The rage that had been a cold, calculated force for days suddenly roared to life, a blinding, white-hot inferno. "Do it now," Hadrian snarled, his voice vibrating with a terrifying intensity. "Initiating the burn," Linnea replied, slamming her hand down on the enter key. The digital trap snapped shut. The €2.5 million transfer, suspended in the deep web escrow, instantly reversed, evaporating from Vane's proxy server and returning to the Foundation's secure accounts. Simultaneously, Linnea triggered the floodlights Hadrian had installed on the perimeter of Sector 4. The abandoned docks erupted in blinding, brilliant white light. Vane cursed viciously, raising his weapon, his eyes darting frantically as he realized the funds had vanished. Lumina stumbled back from the crate, a cry of shock escaping her lips, raising a hand to shield her eyes from the sudden, overwhelming glare. The side door of the van slid open with a violent crash. Hadrian stepped out into the harsh light, his shadow stretching long and dark across the wet tarmac. He didn't have a weapon. He had something far more dangerous, the absolute certainty of a man who had already lost everything. "The transaction is cancelled, Elias," Hadrian said, his voice echoing off the rusted steel walls. It was the voice of an executioner. "And the wreath belongs to Athens." Lumina spun around. When she saw him standing there, the blood drained entirely from her face. Her perfectly constructed world of deception shattered into a million irreparable pieces. "Hadrian," she breathed, the word a fragile, terrified gasp. Vane took a step forward, the suppressed muzzle of his weapon leveling directly at Hadrian's chest. The air crackled with the terrifying, immediate threat of death. The final, brutal unearthing had begun. The blinding halogen lights of Sector 4 cut through the Athenian fog like physical blades. Elias Vane's suppressed automatic weapon didn't waver from Hadrian's chest. The silence on the wet tarmac was absolute, broken only by the distant, rhythmic sloshing of the dark Aegean Sea against the concrete pylons. "You are a very foolish academic," Vane said softly, his voice a razor blade in the quiet night. He didn't look at Lumina. His eyes were locked on Hadrian with the cold, dead calculation of a predator. The funds are gone. The escrow is a ghost. I don't leave empty-handed. Lumina stood frozen between them, the steel crate containing the Hellenistic wreath resting at her feet. The mask of the brilliant, untouchable architect had completely dissolved, leaving only raw, naked terror. She looked at Hadrian, her eyes wide, begging for a salvation she knew she didn't deserve. "Hadrian, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "You don't understand." "I understand everything," Hadrian replied, his voice devoid of anger, devoid of anything resembling humanity. It was the voice of a tomb. He didn't look at Vane's gun. He looked only at his wife. The access logs, the rusted key to Subbasement C, the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I read the emails. "Lumina, you sold the wreath, and you sold me for a wire transfer." Vane's finger tightened infinitesimally on the trigger. "A touching domestic dispute. But I am leaving with the gold." "No," Hadrian said simply. He raised his hand, a sharp, decisive gesture in the glare of the floodlights. From the shadows of the rusted shipping containers, the Hellenic Police Antiquities smuggling unit emerged. Dozens of heavily armed officers in tactical gear swarmed the perimeter, red laser sights painting Vane's chest and forehead. The wail of approaching sirens suddenly tore through the night, echoing off the steel walls of the port. Vane froze, his eyes darting to the tactical units surrounding him. He was a professional. He knew when the board was lost. Slowly, deliberately, he lowered the weapon and placed it on the wet tarmac, raising his hands. Officers moved in instantly, slamming Vane against the side of his Mercedes, the metallic click of handcuffs sharp and final. Two officers approached Lumina. She didn't fight. She didn't scream. She simply stood there, staring at Hadrian as they secured her wrists behind her back. The devastating realization of her own ruin washed over her face, turning her features to ash. "Hadrian," she sobbed, the sound tearing through the chaotic noise of the arrest. "Hadrian, look at me. I loved you." Hadrian stood perfectly still, his hands in the pockets of his trench coat. He looked at the woman who had shared his bed, his work, and his life for 7 years. He saw the emerald green dress she had worn in the Plaka alleyway. He saw the rusted key hidden in the hollowed book. He saw the agonizing truth. "You loved the excavation," he said softly, his voice barely carrying over the sirens. "And I was just another ruin you decided to loot." He turned his back on her before they put her in the squad car. He walked toward the steel crate. The Hellenistic wreath gleamed up at him, pristine and magnificent, a piece of history successfully reclaimed from the dark. It was the crowning achievement of his career. He had won. But as he stared at the ancient gold, he felt nothing but a profound, suffocating emptiness. Dawn was breaking over Athens when Hadrian finally returned to the apartment on Lycabettus Hill. The sky was the color of bruised violets and pale ash. The silence of the rooms was no longer a sanctuary. It was a mausoleum. He walked into the kitchen. The faint, lingering scent of Lumina's jasmine perfume still clung to the air, a phantom limb that refused to sever. He poured a glass of water, his hands trembling slightly, the adrenaline of the night finally bleeding away into exhaustion. He walked into the study. The hollowed-out copy of the topography of ancient Athens sat on the desk next to the decrypted files and the official police report stating the recovery of the artifact. Hadrian slowly reached down and twisted the gold wedding band on his left hand. The metal felt heavy, an archaic shackle that no longer held any meaning. He slid it off his finger. He placed the ring carefully on top of the police report. It sat there, a tiny, perfect circle of gold beside the documented ruin of his life. He looked out the window, watching the first rays of the sun hit the distant, ancient columns of the Acropolis. He had saved the history of his city, but he had buried his own. "Some ruins are meant to be unearthed," Hadrian whispered to the empty room, the dust motes dancing in the cold morning light. "Others are better left buried under the dust."